عرفت الهوى مذ عرفت هواك عرفت الهوى مذ عرفت هواك وأغلقت قلبي على من عاداك وأغلقت قلبي على من عاداك وقمت أناجيك يا من ترى وقمت أناجيك يا من ترى خفايا قلوبي.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم على سيدنا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم أجمعين. سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah. It is always very, very refreshing to come to this part of the world. That, mashallah, that you have something very special, and that a person that comes from a society the likes of the one that I live in, that really deeply, that there is something very special here that's refreshing, that it brings, it rejuvenates you, and not only the physical beauty, but that really the beauty that are in the people here. When I see the manifestation of Islam in a country like Malaysia or in Singapore or in Indonesia, that I really hope for my fellow brothers and sisters who converted to this religion, that oftentimes get very confused by various different approaches to the religion and so forth, that they come to this part of the world to see that what has happened over a period of several hundred years that has led to all of these manifestations that we see. So it is always wonderful to be here and to reunite with a number of special people. That I have to say the only place that's harder to get to for an American is probably Australia, which is why I have to meet with Imam Afroz here. But a 20-hour flight and a 12-hour time difference doesn't make this an easy thing to do, although it would be nice to do this more often. The brief comments that I will make on the topic of the characteristics of a middle path. First, I do think that this is a very important topic in general, but especially in our time. And that I will be assuming that the majority of the audience obviously are Muslims, so I'll be assuming a perspective of that of the Quran. That the Quran teaches us a worldview of the importance of balance, of being centered. And that this is reflected in a verse that's in the first chapter of the Quran, Ihdinas Siratal Mustaqim, that guide us to the straight path. And what's understood in that regard is that if you imagine a path, and it being straight, is that there's one of two ways you could diverge from that path. You could either swerve to your right or you could swerve to your left. So in other words, is that this is at the very heart of our understanding. And that this understanding penetrates that all three dimensions of the religion, which are the pillars, in relation to belief, in relation to practice, in relation to character, ethics, morality, is that there is a balance, if you will, that in all of these three different dimensions, and that thousands of years, hundreds of years before it was politically correct to talk about moderation, is that Allah says about the ummah of the Prophet, وَكَذَلِكَ جَعْنَاكُمْ أُمَّةً وَسَطًا, and thus that we have made you a nation, an ummah, which nation, we oftentimes think of the nation state here, a prophetic community, that is wasatan, that is centered, that is of the middle way. And that this idea of being centered, of being grounded, and all of these words that are evoked, that we think in Arabic of like thabat, grounding, that we think of wasatiyah, that we think of mizan, balance, all of these words that come to mind are very much a part of the Quranic worldview and very important at all different levels of our deen. Now, if I may at this point get a little bit technical, and I know sometimes that for people who speak English as a second language, I've always been told that I speak too fast, one, and secondly, some of the words that I'll be using might be difficult to understand because I want to take you through a very brief history lesson, but it's essential to the topic at hand. And because we've inherited a world that has lost its center, and this is essentially what I'm trying to get at, is that we live in a globalized world. is that now many of the same things when I arrive at the airport in that Kuala Lumpur, right? I see these, that in JFK, which I came from. You see these in Istanbul, this was my transit. And you literally see it all over the world, many of the same manifestations. The globalized world happened in a very specific way, although theoretically it didn't have to happen that way. There are that limitless possibilities of the way that it could have become globalized. There are ways, then there are possibilities of how the world would experience these globalized realities other than the way that it happened. And there are many social critics that point to many of these facts, and oftentimes, unfortunately, that I would say, my opinion would be, many of the negative aspects of Western society tend to reach the furthest most regions of the world, such that if I'm in a sacred city like Tarim, where I spent time studying, that all of a sudden I see someone with it doesn't even look like a human being, a WWE. Back in the day when I was young, it was WWF, where we still had people like Hulk Hogan and Junkyard Dog and Andre the Giant. It was much simpler in that time. But now I don't even know the names of these characters anymore, and I guess they had to change it because the WWF was actually the World Wildlife Federation or something like that, so they had to change their name. I don't even know what it stands for, WWE now. But anyhow, I see him wearing a shirt in the middle of a city that just recently got internet access. And what does that mean to this individual? Why is he so enamored with this character who's probably taken a lot of steroids, has paint all over his face, and really looks more like an animal than he does a human being? Why did that t-shirt get exported, right, and arrive and this person's wearing it and thinks that this is something cool? This is the nature of what I'm talking about, that oftentimes this has been the case. And that Joseph Stiglitz has a very good book titled The Discontents of Globalism. It's a social critique on globalism. All of this to say is that we've inherited a world that has lost its center, because the reality of the globalized world is a Western reality, that it stems from Western Europe, and then as it crossed the continent ends up in America, and then through colonization ends up all over the world in a very short, simplified version. But it's a Western history, and that the architects of this modern mindset essentially are white European males. There's almost no females, and that there's almost no non-whites. Even some of that polar opposites of what has the dominant trends that have taken over, like capitalism, that Marxism and socialism, that they themselves were also Europeans, lest we forget. That we demonize them as the other in the West, but they are the Europeans. They're part of the same story. And I'm saying all this to say is that we have to be aware of these tendencies, is that the world is not neutral. If I walk out into the public space, that you're not, in general, no matter where you are, it's not a neutral space. And our Lord teaches us in the Quran, وَالْعَصْرِ إِنَّ الْإِنسَانَ لَفِي خُسْرٍ. By time, indeed, that humankind is in loss. In other words, is that the Quranic, that worldview is one that if you are not preoccupying yourself with good, if you are not doing something, positively speaking, you are being drawn into something. If you are not impacting, you are being impacted. There is no neutrality in that sense. Is that the world, things are highly charged. Another metaphor would be one of a current. That you're not entering into a lake with still water. That oftentimes, depending upon where you live on the face of this earth, is that there's currents and that there's degrees of how swift those currents are moving. And so when you enter into a current, if you think things are neutral, is that you don't realize that you actually didn't learn how to swim, and you're actually being taken downstream. And to the degree of the swiftness of the current is to the degree that you know how to swim and to maneuver and hold on to this rock and move around the bank here. And then this is really what is required in our time. And this is one of the things that I really encourage, is that people worldwide, increasingly in the globalized world, I found is that unfortunately you would think in the age of information, people would have that more awareness, but people have information overload. And that we have now, we're exposed in 1 week, that we are exposed in 1 week, that actually the stat says that a 1 week subscription of the New York Times is an equivalent to what pre-modern people, that amount of knowledge they were exposed to in an entire lifetime. So we, on a daily basis, are inundated with that stories in the media, with that all different types of facts and information, but it's not neutral. There are a series of underlying assumptions behind all of that. And that when we receive that, if we just take it in and apply it, then that this could cause problems within our own self and within our communities as a result. Is that we have to understand and be able to strip it from its underlying assumptions, which is a very long, arduous process of doing this, and it requires being grounded in two different worlds. So a little bit about this world that has lost its center. There was what was called in the medieval world, and what I mean by the medieval world is that this is pre-Reformation, pre-Enlightenment in Western Europe, was called the Great Chain of Being. And that the roots of the Great Chain of Being stem back to the Greek period, but it was adopted by Christianity because it not only fit common sense, it fit the biblical vision of the world. And some of the key features of the Great Chain of Being is that the earth is static. In the Ptolemaic universe, the earth is static and it's the center of the universe. And everything else is revolving around it. And then there was a series of concentric spheres. I know, very difficult English words, I'm sorry. Essentially, that you have the earth, that you have the moon, you have the sun, you have the stars, and then at the outermost sphere, in the Christian depiction of God, is where God that lived and existed. Now, we obviously would have a much more nuanced theological discussion about that as Muslims, because we don't believe that God exists within the time-space continuum, nor do we believe that God is separate from his creation. Otherwise, how would he affect it? But that's a theological discussion. Anyhow, is that in this understanding, that's also at the realm of the human being, is that you had God, and then you had the angels, and various degrees of angels, and then you had that human beings. And then there was a hierarchy within the human beings, is that you had the monarchs, the kings and the queens, and then you had the aristocracy, then you had the merchant class, and then you had serfs, and then you had that slaves. And so that in this, the way that this was used was anyone that tried to challenge. So a serf that tried to become a merchant, this was highly discouraged, and they were thought to that be fighting against this idea of the great chain of being, because they used religion to sanction this. And that we have that in the findings of Copernicus, who was one of the first to that articulate the idea of a universe that is actually the earth is revolving around the sun. And then following up on Copernicus was Galileo, which, as we all know, what happened to him as a result of that. And then slowly, over a period of 200 to 300 years, the idea of the great chain of being started to break down. And that Western scholars who analyze this that point to 6 different factors in relation to that. We can mention them if you want, but they're very technical. The nation state played part of it. The discovery of the New World definitely played part in it. But the 2 main factors were Renaissance humanism and the scientific and rational revolutions. And essentially what that means is that with new findings in science, is that what was creed previously, i.e., is that the earth is unmoving, the earth is not moving, and everything is revolving around it. That once that it seems to be the case, actually, we're revolving around the sun, and not the opposite. This is a great theological problem, and this was heresy. Now, by way of that side note, I think it's really interesting to me, is that Muslims never had a problem with this. There is nothing in the Quran or in the Hadith of the Prophet ﷺ that makes you believe that the earth is one unmoving or is at the center of the universe, in that if you don't, in a spatial sense, and if you don't believe that you're not Muslim. On the contrary, is that this to me is something that could be fit into even a Quranic worldview. The idea of that the earth revolving around the sun. But we believe that the human beings are at the center of the universe, that in a spiritual sense, and that we have an ability to know God. And because of that, we're at the center, not in a spatial sense. And that's a side point. But what ends up happening is, through this process of Renaissance humanism, where essentially human beings become the measure for everything, not religion and God, is that this led to the Protestant Revolution, this led to the Enlightenment, this led to the rational and scientific revolutions, and that over, again, a period of several hundred years, the world that we've all bequeathed. What ends up happening then as a result of all of this, and this is a very complicated, you have to read a lot of books to fully understand this process, but the result, the import of all this, is that man loses his center. And that no longer is man-centered. Because of the breakdown of the great chain of being, where there was, at least, with its faults, that there was man knew his center. And that, again, I'm not trying to compare or contrast this from an Islamic perspective. I'm trying to get to the point that we've inherited a world where man has lost his center. And that this world essentially has been exported, right, all throughout the world. And that we as Muslims have to understand this, is that when we talk about the characteristics of a middle path, unless that we can understand really what has happened there and how we're going to position ourselves in relation to it, is that we ourselves run the risk of also becoming that decentered, of losing our own center. And that the Quranic perspective is one, and if we look at this beautiful verse that talks about belief, that Allah Ta'ala says in the Quran that, have you not seen that how Allah has coined the metaphor that a kalima tayyiba ka shajara tayyiba, that a good word is as a good tree. Asluha thabitun wa far'uha fis sama'. Its roots are deep and its branches are in the sky. Tu'ti ukulaha kulla hinin bi idhni rabbiha. It gives fruit by the leave of its Lord every season. And then that Allah goes on to speak about the likeness of a good word, of a corrupt word is as a corrupt tree. اجتثت من فوق الأرض ما لها من قرار. It's been uprooted, and thus that it has no stability. And so that if you look at this idea of a tree, is that a tree that if its roots run deep, is that it's going to be able to not only sustain itself, because trees that, although some trees absorb a little bit of moisture through their leaves, but generally speaking, it's through the roots, and then that sends it through the tree. That if you're not rooted, what happens to a tree that is not rooted? It dies. What happens to branches that are not tight on the tree when the winds of tribulation come is that they're blown away. And so the Quranic perspective is one that teaches us that in order to truly be rooted, and by extension to be centered, and by extension that be truly oriented, is that you have to have faith. There has to be a belief in a creator. This is what is going to root someone. This is what's going to ground someone and center us, is that faith. Whereas without belief, and this is why that many people refer to modern man, quote unquote, that as a nomad, that is in a wasteland. And that this is what happens, is that if you do not have that some type of standard that to determine that objectively speaking, that whether it be that moral or ethical realities or anything else, then it's a complete free-for-all. Then it's just what ends up happening is that if you take out that belief in God, which that the primary reason all of the individual rulings of the sacred law point back to a training of the soul so that it can protect ourselves from our own caprice, from the verse that Imam Afroz just quoted. Because that if you are not centered from in a God-centric world, is that you will be centered and really decentered according to your passions. And if you look at the nature of the hawa and the desires and the passions, is that they are fickle and they are volatile. In other words, is that the passions, okay, I'm going to do this now, I'm going to go here now, do this, do that. Like there's no consistency to them. That it's just complete fickleness. It's complete volatility. And that as opposed to someone being grounded, is that when those things rise, is that okay, should I do this? Should I not do this? How do I understand this? How do I not understand this? How do I process this whole thing? And that the ramifications of this are extremely important, because is that it is only due to the degree that the realities of faith come into the heart, and then that follows with it the next dimension of that, which is practice and conformity to that one's beliefs that they previously had, that they then leads into this third dimension where is the dimension of ethics and morality, akhlaq, character traits, that how it is that we deal with other people. And that not taking into consideration that disbelief at this point, that everything that I just mentioned applies to Muslims themselves. And I think one of the greatest challenges of the time in which we live is that because Muslims themselves have become decentered, is that they've become unstable, that the result is that in the furthest extent, which is that of akhlaq and character, is that what we see happening in all of these different diversions and perversions that of Islam, that in many different places throughout the world, is that there is a clear lack of stability which has led someone not to be able to process that the circumstances that they are experiencing, and thus that they end up following the worst parts of their ego and lower self, and that the danger of that is they justify that in relation to the religion. And that this is a calamity, the degree to which is very difficult to explain how serious this is. And that this article that was written recently in the Atlantic Monthly by this academic by the name of Graham Wood, where that what ISIS really wants. This was the most read article in the history of the Atlantic Monthly. And essentially his thesis is one that says that ISIS is not only Islamic, that they're really Islamic. They're more audacious than even some of the more extreme groups that preceded them, is that they want to recreate the prophetic period in our time in bringing back things like slavery, and all these other types of things. And so that they're actually really Islamic. And the problem is that there's a lot of people that actually listened to that and fell into that trap, where this is that, they've taken on the import of this article. And that from a balanced perspective, that if we look at this, is that it's really interesting to note that the majority of people that end up doing these types of things, and Imam Afroz was just mentioning this about a recent situation in Australia, that if we look at the past of the people that end up getting involved, in the majority of cases, is that they're oftentimes from troubled pasts, that they're disturbed people. And that what ends up happening if you're disturbed is that you're looking for anything to change your circumstances. And so from this point, I do think it's important, although from a Muslim perspective, we're always introspective, that we always have naqd of that, and that we're self-critical. So I'm not justifying. What I will say though is if we look at the socioeconomic condition in many Muslim countries, that because of the situation, that someone comes along and creates, a discourse that can pull them in and to be a source in their mind to alleviate many of the difficulties that they're experiencing, that in the socioeconomic sense, is that people latch onto it. And it's not necessarily an ideological thing where they're convinced, but they latch onto it because that this is a way out from their dismal reality. Is that they're 35 years old in Cairo, and that they're making their version of minimum wage, and they haven't been able to get married yet, and all of these other types of things. And then someone that comes along with even the most remote form of an ideology that's extremist, that, well, I have nothing going for me anyway, that might as well sign on for that. And the vast majority of people, this is really what it's about, not necessarily that they're convinced by what is being said. But this takes us back to this idea of the middle path, is that the middle of path is one where we are centered, where we are oriented. We're oriented in all of the meanings of orientation. We're oriented in terms of time. And if we look at the 5, according to Muslim belief, stages of human existence, the pre-earthly realm, the worldly realm, the realm of the grave, the realm of the judgment on the day of judgment, and then the true final abodes. We're oriented in terms of understanding what came before and what is going to come after. We're oriented in terms of understanding the beginning of the world until the end of the world. And the Quran says that whether that the world was 14 or 16 billion years old or not, Allahu A'lam, Allah knows best. But Allah says in Surah Al-Kahf, مَا أَشْهَدْتُهُمْ خَلْقَ السَّمَوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ. I did not cause them to witness the creation of the heavens and the earth. And so that how long has the world been in existence? Allahu A'lam. You know, there's nothing wrong with trying to find that out scientifically, and this is something that we're encouraged to do. But even when we talk about 14 billion years, is time a constant in that such that, you know, the way that a million years passed, you know, that 20 million years ago, is it the same as the way that million years passes at another time? These are all questions that can't be answered. But we're oriented also in terms of prophetic history, from the first human being until the end of time. We're oriented in a sense of that from the time of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, until the end of time. And that we have a number of teachings that we don't have time to go into the detail that orient us in relation to time. That we're also oriented in relation to space. Is that there's something special about when we all get together to pray. Depending upon where you are on the face of this earth, right here, that you all face west. Right, where we are, that we face east in general, obviously north, but in general you face east until you get to Hawaii, I think it is, where there's Qiblatain, right? Yeah, where you can actually face one of the two directions, and because you know you're pretty much equidistant to where Mecca al-Mukarram is. But we're all facing that al-Qura, the embryonic city of Mecca al-Mukarram. This is a measure that to orient us, but also we know that in the seventh heaven is that we have what is known as the Bayt al-Ma'mur, and that we know with the prophetic description that we're a rock to be dropped from the Bayt al-Ma'mur every day, in it which enters 70,000 angels in worship and then go out, and 70,000 new ones come the next day. These are things that we can't fully grasp with the intellect. They could be witnessed though, but we understand them through language, and that there is a reality to them, no doubt. But were a rock to drop, it would fall upon the Kaaba. In other words, that we're oriented in how that this realm here relates to that higher realms. And this is one of the controversial, from a religious perspective, that aspects of a scientistic understanding of the world, as opposed to that scientific. There's a difference between science and scientism. And if someone believes that the only thing that could exist could exist only if it could be proven by science, well, that's something that you've decided, and that's arbitrary in a sense, because science is limited in terms of what it can ultimately come to conclusions about. It has to be something that's tangible. Whereas that in a number, if you study comparative religion, definitely Islam has an idea of multiple levels of reality. And that these multiple levels of reality can't be proved or disproved by science. They're beyond science. And that they relate to, but how that this world itself relates to that modes of existence, if you will. But we see throughout that we're oriented and that we're centered in that regard, and that much of this process takes place by that increasing degrees of belief, and that once that belief that takes root in the heart, and we move into the 4 different stages of Tawheed, of belief in divine unity, that Imam al-Ghazali Hujjat al-Islam mentions. That the first is the outermost shell. The second is the internal shell. That if you look at, for instance, like an almond, it comes with like a covering. You take that off, right, there's a shell. And then you have the kernel. And then were you to press the kernel, that would turn into that some type of that oil. 4 different degrees. Is that when you start to experience the higher degrees of belief, is that the more is that what other people take for granted in the phenomenal world of the one that is witnessed with the physical eye, is that the more that you start to see the opaqueness of that reality, and how that this is actually the least real dimension of reality. But that comes through faith, and that comes through a strengthening of that faith, which gets back to this whole point of that if we don't have a concept of that character, if we don't have a concept of a practical methodology in how to realize the realities of Iman, Islam, and Ihsan, is that you won't be able to maintain your center. You will be decentered. And that then what will happen is that this balance that we're trying to achieve, in terms of that balance of belief, that balance in terms of practice, and even in terms of our ethical theories, the balance in terms of the science of Ihsan and of excellence, is that you will be set off, and that once you are off balance, is that to the degree that you are, you will diverge from this idea of the middle path. And I will end by saying, this is why that I know a lot of that was very complicated, and I will say one of the great beauties of our deen is that you don't really have to understand much of what I just said. All you have to understand is the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And that if you compare like our ethics to, let's say, Greek ethics, that Greek ethics, although we did appropriate that many things from Aristotelian ethics, and especially Imam Ghazali does this in the Ihya al-Ulumuddin, and we have a distilled version essentially of Greek ethics that has been Islamicized. At the same time, that Greek ethics is only for, you know, the elite of the society, and even the choice few of the elite. You can't even understand it. So if you can't understand it, how could you realize it? That in Islam is that the center of our ethics, of excellence, of good character is our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And that once you understand the dimensions of his life, and how he was, and how he interacted with people in its totality, not by listening to Daniel Pipes and Pamela Geller about one specific aspect of his life where he took a particular position, if it was even accurate the way that they're presenting it, in light of his entire life. And this is why one of our teachers, Habib Ali Jifri, that he advised that before you study the seerah, that you should actually study the shama'il. The seerah is the life story of the Prophet. The shama'il are his characteristics. And there's a beautiful book that has been translated, Wasa'il al-Wusul al-Shama'il Rasul, by Shaykh Yusuf al-Nabahani. It's been translated recently by a great translator, the Sidi Abdul Aziz Soraka. He lives in Canada now, although he's an American. And it's been published by Al-Madina Institute. I'm not sure if it's being sold yet in the stores or if you can find it online. But it's a great book to come to know your Prophet. And that once you know the Prophet, is that you will have the standard and the measure by which that you can look at the actions of anyone, that scholar or common person. And to the degree that you know that your Prophet will be to the degree that you know the epitome of balance. There was no other balanced human being as balanced as the Prophet Muhammad in human history. And that it's in that balance, this is his greatness. Sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, in all of these different dimensions that were mentioned. So these are just some basic thoughts on this topic. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless us always to follow Sirat al-Mustaqim, to protect us from any diversions in any ways, protect us from ifrat and tafrit, bless us to be able to realize the realities of La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah, bless us with a close, experiential, intimate connection with our Prophet. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sallam. Alhamdulillah.